In this video, I'm going to show you how to use Houdini scattered primitives to create foliage in Unreal Engine 4. So what we're going to do is first we're going to just do a basic scatter of some objects and turn them into foliage. And to do that, we're going to first scatter objects onto a UE4 landscape, assuming that's use foliage on a landscape, so it's pretty much the only place that makes sense for it. Then we're going to scatter packed primitives, which are the Houdini equivalent of a static or instanced mesh in Unreal Engine. And then finally, we're going to bake those to foliage. As an extra, I'm going to do some things that are, this is just a generic scatter node thing, which lets you control the size and the normal of it so that you can give each of the placed primitives a little bit more variation. So the first thing we're going to do is scatter to an Unreal Engine 4 landscape. And we're going to start in Houdini, do a basic scatter using a grid scatter node, copy to points node. Then we're going to turn that into an Houdini digital asset. And we're going to expose two parameters on the Houdini digital asset, force total count and global seed. And then finally, we're going to connect the subnet's #1 input to the scatter node, which will let us feed in the landscape once we move over to Unreal Engine. Then we're going to move over to Unreal Engine and use the landscape as the input. So let's get started in Houdini. So here's a blank project. I'm going to put down a geometry node, dive in. I'm going to create a grid. I'm going to put a scatter node down. Let me increase the size of these points so you can see them a little bit better. And then I'm going to put down a copy to points node. Oops. This takes two parameters. One is the target points to copy to, which is going to be our scatter node, and the other one is the geometry we want to copy. And we'll start with a cube. And we'll just make the cube a little bit smaller so that we can see them individually. Maybe I'll turn down the number of objects we're scattering so you can see them all. All right. I'm also going to make the cube bigger in the y direction just so it's a little bit more obvious what's happening. Okay. Then I'm going to turn that entire thing into a digital asset. I'm going to save it in my projects HDA folder just so I can find it later when I'm working with Unreal. I'm going to call it My Scatter. And the parameters I said I was going to expose were on the scatter object. One was force total count and one was global seed. So on force total count, I'm also going to change the max range to be just 1,000 for now so that I don't accidentally make it real high, which can make the Houdini engine take a long time to generate everything. So you can still type in a higher number. That just the slider that will be in Unreal Engine 4 will be low. Okay, so let's accept that. They've turned green, indicating that they're connected to the inputs of the digital asset now. Then I'm going to go to Assets, Save Asset, Subnet 1. And let me just check on the other thing we were going to do is connect subnet. Oh, first let's bring it in. Yeah. We'll go to Unreal Engine first, just so you can see what it's like so far. All right, so here's a empty project in Unreal. I'm going to import that HDA that I made. So here it is under the HDA folder called My Scatter. Drag it in, and you can see it's scattered the objects I asked for, and you can see there, well, let me see where's the location of this. Let me put it at z equals 0. And then let me get rid of this floor also. And just like in Houdini, I can change, here's the two parameters I exposed, force total count and global seed. I can increase force total count and I'll get more geometry. I can change the global seed to get a different variation. Okay, that's great. But if I go down to my baking options, let's see if I can find them. Baking. You can see that, yeah, I can bake it to actors, blueprint, but I can't bake to foliage. And the reason why not is because I haven't created instanced output yet. So each one of these things are being, or is a separate mesh in the scene. It's not like one mesh that's drawn n times. Each mesh is, I should say, it's not using instant static mesh to draw. So we're going to change our Houdini digital asset to support that. So switching back. Actually, let me go back to my outline, see if we're on target. Oh, nope. First, we have to connect subnet 1 to scatter. And that's so we can use it in the landscape. And let me show you what I mean in Unreal Engine first. So if I put down a new landscape here, and it doesn't really matter what it is. So, oops, yeah, so I'll just create that. I accidentally made the overall resolution too big, so it's taking a little while. Oh yeah, I made that way too big. Let's just delete that and try again. For this test, we can turn it way down. It's not that important. Okay, and then I'll just sculpt a little bit of hills. All right, that should be fine. So now I've managed to scatter all of these onto a grid, all these boxes, but what I want to do is scatter them on the landscape. And so what we have to do is go back to the Houdini digital asset and do that. So we go into the subnet, and what we need here is access to input 1. So we'll go over to inputs and say, it's under basic, and we say minimum inputs 1, maximum inputs 1. We say accept, and now we get an input. Now instead of the grid, we'll feed whatever's in this input into the scatter node. Now it doesn't know what we're giving it yet, so it's going to get a little bit pissed off here. Also, while we're in here, I'm going to go to the, no, I'll do that next. Sorry, don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay, so one thing you can do too is you can put a switch in here so that you can have either a grid or a mesh, or a height field like I'm planning to use. I'm just going to do the simple way right now. So I've changed that. We need to resave the asset. Go back to Unreal Engine. Rebuild all instances of that asset. And now when we look here on my scatter in World Outliner, you'll see I have a Houdini input now, and I can pick what I want to feed it. And so I'm going to drop this down and select landscape input. And then it has a picker, so I can pick the landscape I want. And that's it. Now all my objects are scattered around the landscape. And let me create more of them so that you can actually see them. Well, I'll fly around the landscape so you can see there's a couple. And you're probably wondering, why is everything floating above the landscape? And that's because I exported the landscape as a height field, and I need to use mesh. And when you do that, it'll work with the copy to points node. So there we go. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that it looked like it laid down all of the objects that I was scattering, and I'm not sure why, so we'll figure that out in a second. Let me go over to my notes again and see if we're... So we've done all this stuff. We've selected the landscape as input. So now let's go to the next slide, which is scatter packed primitives. And I think doing this will probably fix the problem with the meshes being laid down. So the first thing we're going to do is go into Houdini and turn on the packed instance in the copy to points node. Then we'll just take a look at the node info so you can see the difference between having that on and off. And then in UE4, we'll select different meshes to instance. Okay, so back to Houdini. In the scatter node, copy to points node, here's the packed instance checkbox. That's all we got to do. Save the asset again. Back to Unreal Engine. Rebuild all instances of the asset again. And now you'll see a couple things. So first, we get a Houdini instanced input, and this allows us to actually change it to another mesh. So like if I look for sphere, I can turn them all into spheres, or any other mesh, cones in there. Yeah, and you can see they're all laying down, so we'll get that fixed in a second. They are scattered on top, but they're just pointed to the side instead of straight up like you'd expect. But since I do have packed instances selected now, you will see that I can bake them to foliage. So just to show you that, I'll hit baked to foliage. Successfully baked 3,000 instances of cone to foliage. And I can actually get rid of this my scatter node now if I want from the scene. I should be able to. It's not letting me. I'll just hide the visuals on it for now. And then if I go over to foliage, you can see, yep, I got 3,000 instances here of this cone. And so it created this foliage type and placed them. And I can now use all the foliage tools that Unreal has. Like I can select an individual one, move it around. Of course, if I went and used my tool again, it wouldn't know any of this, but yeah. So they're all the same size though. I'll show you how to create a little bit more variation with that in a second. So I'm going to delete these. Bring my tool back. Okay, and then go back to my slides. Oh, one thing we forgot to do was look at node info, so I'll go back and show you that. So looking at node info on the copy to points node, So I'm going to switch to the grid just so I can get rid of this error, which isn't really an error when you're using it as a digital asset. And you can see right now the number of packed geos I'm using is 118. And that's because my scatter node has 118 selected here. If I slide this around, you'll see this changes. So this is 512 now. Now there's 512 packed geos. And if, on the other hand, I tell copy to points, scatter, copy to points, yes, to not use packed in instance, then instead of a bunch of packed geos, you'll see a whole bunch of polygons. And you can see how much more geometry is used when you're doing non-instanced or non-packed versus instanced or packed. So, and if you want to use foliage, you have to have packed. So we're turning that on. So this is what you should see. You should see packed geos. All right. I showed you how to select a meshed instance. We baked the foliage. I showed you that the button's only enabled when the HDA has instanced output. So the next thing we're going to do is use some attributes to control the scatter. And this will let us put variation in the scale of the object and also variation in the normal. So let's get to it. So I just got to cheat and look at my other project that I have that shows me what the attributes are called. So, I mean, I know what they're called, but actually how I set them up. So we're going to be using these nodes called Attribute Randomize. And the first one we're going to do is P-scale. So by default uses CD, which is color. But we're going to use P-scale. And what P-scale does, I'll just show you the documentation on it real fast. Under geometry attributes, you can see all of these. And P-scale right here is a uniform scaling factor. So it's just a single float, and it scales it on all three axes the same amount. So that way we don't get distortion, we just get different sized objects. Right, so this is a randomizer, so we're going to say go ahead and use uniform distribution. We're only, in this case it's a single float, so our dimensions should be 1. And the smallest we ever want it to be is, say, 0.3, and the biggest we ever want it to be is 1. So that should be good for that. And then for the next one, we're going to randomize the direction it's pointing. And so this is the N attribute, or the normal attribute. We'll also use a continuous distribution. In this case, it is 3 dimensions because a normal has 3 axes. It's a vector, it's a 3-dimensional vector. And for the min value, all zeros, I guess. It's a normal actually always has a length of 1, so it's kind of weird for it to all be zeros, but this worked in my other code, so I'm going to keep it. I'm not quite sure exactly why I did that. And then I'm not going to let it change in one of the directions, and so that's the y value is always going to be 0 here. So it's going to change like which way it's pointing around the y value. So it's going to let it spin randomly, but not kind of lay down. Okay, so then those attributes need to be added before the scatter node. So I'm going to throw them in here. And already you can see when I add the P-scale attribute, I've gotten variation in the size of the objects. And now when I add in the normal, I'm getting variation in rotation as well. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my subnetwork input. Oh, also just as a thing that you probably want to do, you should add an output node to your Houdini digital assets. That way, it doesn't matter what you have set up as the display or render node. The output will always be used. And it's because sometimes when you're debugging, you're in here clicking around and you might leave it on box, for instance, and that's all that's there. You go back into Unreal and all you see is the box, and that's because you have this thing set to render mode. But if you have your output node on there, the Houdini digital asset always uses this for rendering output. All right, so let's save the Houdini digital asset again. Jump back over to Unreal. Rebuild all instances. Now they're pointing up because I set the normal the direction I wanted. It's probably because I didn't give them a normal, so they're just laying down for some reason. Okay. And if I wanted to, I could lift them all up. You could see they're like kind of under the terrain a little bit, under the landscape. And that's, you know, you basically have to, you could adjust that in Houdini or on the Unreal Engine side, but it's kind of not important for what I'm showing you now because I'm just trying to get you to scatter stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and change this back to the default box thing that I had created. So we'll just fly around and look at some of them and observe that they're all rotated slightly differently. There's different sizes. And I'm also going to increase this to 6,000 to double the density here. So I'll just take a moment while it's computing that. Now it's put it under my terrain, possibly because I don't have this zeroed out. Actually, that probably doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm not sure what I just did. I need to debug this. So I'm just putting everything back at 0 to see what's going on. And then I want to change something on here just to get it to regenerate. Now let's go take a look at it. I'm not seeing a huge variation in sizes, but I guess I went between 0.3 and 1. I probably should have gone a little bit more severe to make it more obvious. I'll do that real quick. This would be a good thing to expose, actually, so why don't we do that? So I'm going to go back to type properties, parameters, and I'm going to expose my min value and my max value for my scales. So I'll also call that scale min and scale max. Forgot to save it. Need to remember to do that. So save the asset. Rebuild all instances. Okay, so now I have these scale values. I really only needed the first one. I brought them in as a 4-dimensional vector, but it's only the first value on each one. So I'm going to change scale max to 4, so a lot bigger. And then, so now I can see a lot of variation. So I'll just fly around the scene so we can take a look. So now once again, I'll just select this and bake it to foliage. Then I'll hide the My Scatter actor. The foliage is still there. So now you can see this foliage actor. And from here, I can also change, you know, what's my foliage actor. And that thing will be instanced, and it'll work just like foliage. And that's it.